tragic. Nearly 3,000 people lost their lives in a natural disaster, which is horrible and obviously shouldn't happen. Thank you so much for that reporting. Appreciate it, Layla. And turning to the Pentagon now, right after his Singapore summit with Kim Jong-un, the president said that the North Korean nuclear threat was over. Well, today, 2.5 months later, his defense secretary was asked if he agrees. His answer, well, it's not so simple.
Does the Pentagon share that assessment?
You know, Tom, you're asking for a straightforward answer on a complex subject. The bottom line is there was progress made. The whole world saw that progress when the two leaders sat down. We also knew very clearly this was going to be a long and challenging effort to negotiate this away.
There are also new complications today in the denuclearization process that the president claimed was done. North Korea back-channeled a letter to the United States in which it warned talks were in peril. Meanwhile, the defense secretary was asked if the U.S. would suspend any more joint military exercises with South Korea beyond the ones the president called off after the summit.
We have no plans at this time to suspend any more exercises. We suspended several exercises at the direction of the president. The good faith effort was made. We have done no planning for suspending others. Obviously, we know what exercises are out there, so we could do that if directed to. But right now, there are no plans to go further.
CNN's Barbara Starr joins us live from the Pentagon. Barbara, you can put Pentagon speak into layman's terms better than anyone, so let's hear it. Explain what he was trying to say and what the significance is.
Well, I think it all boils down to progress in Singapore turns into politics between North Korea and the United States right now. On the question of exercises, what the secretary is really saying is he's not committing to anything right now. They canceled the initial round this past year, and as they look ahead to scheduled exercises for next year, they'll make up their mind when they get to it. And it's coming right now, as you say, when the North Koreans are trying to put a little doubt about the progress of the discussions with the U.S., suggesting that the discussions are hitting a snag, and the president responding by saying, okay, well, Mike Pompeo's not going to North Korea then. So you're seeing a lot of political maneuvering on both sides. What it adds up to, I think we're only going to know in the months ahead. Dana?
Barbara, thank you so much for that reporting. And back here around the table, Olivier, what's your take on this?
Well, it's interesting to watch what North Korea is doing. The most important thing they're doing right now, I think, is moving like gangbusters to normalize their relations with South Korea. That's putting a bit of a wedge between the United States and that ally. The sanctions regime, the maximum pressure campaign, seems to be wobbling a bit. You've seen the Trump administration impose sanctions on several entities for violating those sanctions. I'm told there are a lot of other entities that could qualify for those kinds of sanctions. The point about the North Korean nuclear threat, though, not to get too semantic, threat is capability plus intent. That's why we don't hear a lot about the French nuclear threat to the United States. After the Singapore summit, a number of Trump administration people came away thinking that Kim really did want to denuclearize. And that is what led them to make the comment that they didn't see, that they thought the threat might be over because the intent was going away. I think they were wrong at the time. I think they would be wrong to say that now. But it's getting hot.
And what do you think in terms of the White House that you cover every day? I mean, President Trump, rightly so, was very proud of himself for getting further than he thought anybody else had. Took a big chance, a big risk in meeting with a dictator to try to focus on the end, never mind the means. What does your reporting tell you about what's going on within the National Security Council and the president's thinking on this?
I mean, I think so the president came out immediately after the summit and made these incredibly exuberant remarks, you know, as you mentioned earlier, that, you know, the threat is gone, you know, that the meeting itself had been a huge success. And everyone at the State Department, I think, and in the White House who works in the national security area realized that there was going to be a lot of groundwork to be laid and a lot of follow-up that was going to happen to make that a reality, that wasn't actually the reality at that point, but they were going to work very hard to make that the reality. And I think what we've seen in the weeks and months since is those efforts have have run into a series of brick walls or dead ends, and we've seen Mike Pompeo wanting to move forward with this, appointment of a special envoy and the scheduling of new meetings, but realizing through this letter and through the communication that they're having with the North Koreans and the South Koreans, frankly, that this is not actually on the track that they want it to be on. And they can't keep saying that these things are a reality if they're not. And what you heard Mattis say just then, I mean, his wording was very careful, as it always is. The president directed us to call off those military exercises. Well, if you recall, that took everyone by surprise a bit.
Yes, it did.
Right after that summit. And so we did it when he asked us to. But at this point, they're looking at the landscape, and they don't. I don't think he sees any likelihood that that's going to be happening.
And let's remember, we've seen this movie before in several presidencies of both parties trying with Kim Jong-un's father and grandfather to find a way around this, and then ended up at a stalemate. And that's something that Angus King, independent senator of Maine, made very clear today.
This administration doesn't seem to want to remember history. This is the 5th time we've been in negotiations about nuclear weapons with North Korea, and the dance has been pretty much the same each time. They come up, they talk about making concessions and backing off. They get concessions from us or from the Chinese or from other people that are interested, and then they backslide. So this is not unusual, and I'm afraid what worries me is that the administration might lurch from excessive optimism to excessive pessimism and let slip at least an opportunity to keep talking.
And there's somebody who caucuses with the Democrats saying just at least stay at the table.
Right, and there is a political component to all of this, which is that President Trump did get high marks from the public for attempting diplomacy with North Korea, which came after a long period of saber rattling that made a lot of people nervous about, potentially the worst happening. I was in Tennessee some weeks ago, and the Democratic candidate, Phil Bredesen, praised the president for trying something new and different. That's where we were, but the polls show that the president's handling of this issue seems to be slipping a little bit, and I wonder how voters are going to react between now and November, given that this was one of the few things, along with the economy, that the president was getting high marks for.
Yeah, in the moment, it was an example of him not caring what history was, not caring what had happened in previous administrations, and just doing what he wanted to do. And people liked that. But now he's having to deal with the consequences of doing what he's doing. And voters are seeing, oh, right, that history that we forgot about, that's playing out again.
Yeah. And look, we're in the middle of this. We don't know how it's going to end. And why don't we just quote John McCain now? It's always darkest before it's black. Up next, speaking of John McCain, he certainly was one of a kind. But does that mean he's the last of a dying breed? We'll discuss next. Later this afternoon, John McCain's best friend in the U.S. Senate will take to the Senate floor and speak about the comrade he lost and also about the Mavericks' mission coming to an end. Over at the White House, the president finally did what friends and colleagues were begging him to do, the right thing, releasing a statement on the death of McCain, saying, despite our differences on the policy and politics, I respect Senator John McCain's service to our country and, in his honor, have signed a proclamation to fly the flag of the United States at half-staff until the day of his interment. Now, tributes from McCain's longtime colleagues were, of course, more effusive, senators tearfully bidding farewell to their friend, colleague, and adversary. But a curious theme also emerged, many of them pointing to McCain as a dying breed.
We've all heard our whole lives about the importance of patriotism and self-sacrifice. But we cannot take that culture of commitment for granted. The very notion that some causes really are greater than ourselves only survives because service members and statesmen like John McCain will fight and even die to defend it.
It's just so fascinating to me. We've seen, obviously, over the last generation, a shift from military service being a requirement for the highest office in the land. It was kind of a no-brainer to starting with, obviously, Bill Clinton, the first who didn't serve, and then really going up through now. I mean, we haven't seen somebody in the White House, even though they had opponents who did have military service. What does that say to you guys?
Well, I mean, I think there's clearly a generational difference here, that you don't have the people who served in, in World War II. You don't have people who served in Vietnam in public life as much anymore. That generation is aging. But I also think it's a cultural difference in our politics. This idea that McConnell was referencing, that you're serving something that's bigger than yourself, and what he didn't say, but I think is the clear implication, bigger than your party. John McCain was a legislator who kind of reveled in that process and in that idea that he was dedicated to some ideals that didn't have to do with the R after his name. And if you look at the U.S. Senate right now, and certainly the House of Representatives, you don't see a lot of that. There, you see some older members who still have that kind of a take on what their service really means, but that is not the generation of politicians that we're seeing in elected leadership that we're seeing right now.
I want to read something from John Harris, who's a longtime D.C. reporter, now the editor of Playbook in Politico. He writes, "In an age in which most political and media elites have no military experience, there does seem to be a romantic longing for what people imagine the military and its values represent. But in real life, when people who claimed that their biographies represent such virtues actually face the electorate at the presidential level, the response has been harsh. The reason McCain's death has resonated so deeply is that everyone recognizes that Trump is the more authentic representative of the age."
It's interesting. McCain and Trump, McCain was several years older than Trump, but they came from kind of the same world. They both grew up lives of privilege. McCain went into military service. The president had several draft deferments. And now as president hasn't been to a war zone. Talks a lot about the military, but hasn't always immersed himself in that life to try to understand what it means to be in the military, what the real needs of the military are. So as we see our political class get filled with more and more people who don't have a direct tie, they haven't served themselves, their child hasn't served, there is this fear that there's this disconnect between the policies that we're making, the decisions that we're making, and what's actually happening foreign policy-wise.
That's right. And yet, to be sure, we're talking about the presidency, but on a lower level, it still exists. It still exists. We talked about Martha McSally. I want to play one quick ad from